He helped an injured Apache woman on a lonely trail. Then a strange mark was carved on his door. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a warm, quiet afternoon when Robert Hayes, a seasoned cowboy living in the lonely stretch of land between the rugged hills and dry plains of the Southwest, made a decision that would change his life forever. Robert had always lived a solitary life, far from the hustle and bustle of town. His ranch was a modest place, tucked away in a secluded valley, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the wind sweeping across the barren landscape and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. For years, Robert had kept to himself, working the land, tending to his cattle, and rarely venturing into town except for supplies. But all of that changed the day he stumbled upon the injured Apache woman on a lonely trail that cut through the thick brush near his property. He had been riding his horse, tracking a herd of wild cattle, when he spotted the figure lying motionless under the shade of a mesquite tree. At first, he thought it was just another animal in distress, perhaps a wild deer that had gotten caught in the thorns. But as he rode closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, an Apache woman. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised, and blood soaked her leg where a deep gash had torn through her flesh. She was unconscious, but Robert could hear her shallow breaths, faint and labored. Without hesitation, Robert dismounted and rushed to her side. He had seen his fair share of injuries in his time, but this was different. This wasn't just some stray animal. It was a human being, and she was in desperate need of help. Robert tore a strip from his shirt to bandage her wound, carefully lifting her into his arms and placing her across the saddle of his horse. He had no idea who she was, or how she ended up here, but he couldn't leave her to die in the wilderness. He rode back to his ranch, making sure she was safe and stable. Over the next few days, he tended to her with the same care he had given his cattle, making sure she had enough food and water. The woman never spoke, not at first. She simply rested, her eyes closed, as though she was trying to escape the pain that had brought her to this point. But Robert, ever patient, knew better than to rush things. Slowly, she began to recover, and in time, she started to speak. But it wasn't until the third day, when the woman sat up and looked him in the eye for the first time, that Robert realized something he had not expected. She wasn't just an injured stranger. She was someone important, someone whose very presence in his life was a sign of things to come. As she spoke, her voice soft but firm, she told Robert she was an Apache from a tribe far to the north, and that she had been traveling alone when she was attacked. She never mentioned who had attacked her, but her eyes darkened when she spoke about her people. Robert listened intently, feeling a strange pull towards this woman, though he knew he should keep his distance. She was grateful for his help, but there was something else in her eyes, a kind of sadness, a weight she carried that Robert couldn't understand. It wasn't until the fourth night that he saw it. As he sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, he heard something, scraping, like a knife against wood. He turned around, his heart racing, only to find that the woman had carved something into the wooden door of his cabin. It was a symbol, an intricate pattern of lines and curves, something foreign and ancient, but somehow familiar. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the mark. It wasn't just a random drawing, it was a message. But from whom? And what did it mean? This was only the beginning. Robert's world, once quiet and predictable, was about to be turned upside down. The woman's presence in his life was no accident, and that mark on his door was just the first sign of the journey ahead. Robert sat still for a moment, staring at the strange mark on his door. The flickering light from the fire cast shadows across the intricate pattern, and his mind raced with questions he could not answer. Who had carved this symbol? And why had the woman left it here? He had been raised on tales of Apache warriors and their mysterious ways, but nothing had prepared him for this. It wasn't just a random marking. It was deliberate, like a warning, a message only meant for those who could understand it. As the woman slept soundly on the cot he had made for her, he tried to piece together the puzzle. He had helped her, and in return, she had given him a sign that there was more to her than just an injured stranger in need of help. The next morning, the woman woke early, as usual. Robert had noticed that she rarely slept through the night, always restless, always listening for something in the dark. He figured it was the trauma from whatever had happened to her, but there was something more to it. As she rose from the cot, she avoided his gaze, but Robert could sense that she knew the mark on the door had been noticed. She didn't speak at first, but the silence between them felt heavy, laden with unsaid words. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "The mark is a sign. It's for you." Robert's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to make of her words, but he needed answers. "What does it mean?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. She met his eyes for the first time, and Robert saw something in her gaze, something that resembled both sorrow and resolve. "It means they know where I am," she said quietly, "and they are coming for me." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. Who was coming? And why had they marked his door? He had no idea who they were, but the implication was clear. He was now involved in something far bigger than he had anticipated. Before he could ask more questions, the woman stood and began to gather her things. "You need to leave," she said, her tone firm. "You're in danger now. It's not just me they're looking for." Robert felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm ready to break. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. The woman hesitated, then sighed, clearly torn. "They're not just after me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're after the information I carry. The information that could change everything." Robert's curiosity was piqued, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Whoever they were not just a band of raiders. They were something else entirely. Something dangerous. "What kind of information?" he asked. The woman looked at him, her face hardening as she spoke. "A secret, a hidden truth about my people, about a place they've kept safe for generations. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything." Robert's mind raced as he processed her words. He had no idea what kind of secret she was talking about, but he could sense the gravity of it. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The woman gathered her things quickly, preparing to leave, but Robert stopped her. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "You can't just leave like this. We need to figure out who's coming and what they want." She turned to him, her face softened for a moment. "You don't understand. You can't help me. You've already done enough. You saved me, and for that, I will be forever grateful. But there's nothing more you can do." Robert's heart sank. He had hoped she would say something that would reassure him, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. The woman, sensing his confusion, looked him in the eye and said, "The mark on your door is only the beginning. If you want to stay alive, you need to stay out of this. I'm leaving, and you should too." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Robert felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He couldn't let her go. Not after everything. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice filled with determination. The woman stopped at the door, her back still to him. She hesitated, then turned slowly. "Then you're already part of this," she said, her words heavy with the weight of inevitability. "There's no turning back now." And just like that, everything changed. Robert knew that he couldn't walk away from this. He had already stepped into a world of danger, a world that was far from the quiet life he had once known. But as the woman left his cabin, Robert made a vow to himself. He would protect her, no matter what the cost. Whatever secret she carried, he would help her carry it. And if they came for her, they would have to go through him first. Robert stood frozen, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He wasn't sure what to make of it. The woman had been right. Once he made the decision to help her, there was no turning back. She had warned him. Now he was a part of whatever she had been running from. The stillness in the cabin was almost unbearable as he glanced toward the door, then back at the fading shadow of her silhouette. He had already stepped too far into this unknown world. He couldn't walk away now. No matter how dangerous it seemed, no matter the cost, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she looked at him like he was her last hope. That bond, however fragile, had formed in those quiet moments when he cared for her, when he promised to protect her, and there was no turning back from that. As he made his way outside, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the rugged land. The air was thick with anticipation, and Robert's thoughts raced faster than he could keep up. He needed to prepare himself. Whatever was coming, it would not be easy. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he moved to the barn, pulling out his rifle and securing his ammunition. He hadn't had to use it in years, but the feeling of the cold steel in his hands was strangely comforting. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing up for someone who had no one else. And that, to Robert, meant everything. The night was heavy with silence as Robert secured the barn doors and checked the perimeter of his land. The distant howl of a coyote echoed through the stillness. But something else was there, something closer, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. The feeling of being watched had crept over him like a shadow, and he knew it wasn't just his imagination. He moved cautiously, scanning the area around him, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the plains. His instincts, honed over years of living alone in the wilderness, told him someone, or something, was out there. He didn't know who, but they were coming for her, and now for him. He heard the faintest rustle in the brush to his left, and his grip tightened around the rifle. His pulse quickened as he stood perfectly still, waiting for any sign of movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of his breath, steady but filled with tension. Then, suddenly, the figure appeared. A shadow among shadows, it moved with the grace of a predator, its eyes gleaming in the dark. Robert's hand went to the rifle at his side, but before he could raise it, the figure stepped into the light. It was her, the Apache woman. She looked different now, more resolute, her face set in a determined expression. "What are you doing?" Robert's voice was a mixture of relief and concern. "I told you to stay away." She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she scanned the area around them, her eyes darting back and forth. "They're coming," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "It's not just a few men this time. They've sent a whole force." Robert's heart sank. He had known something like this was coming, but to hear it from her, so direct, so real, made it feel all the more immediate. "How many?" he asked, his voice tight with fear and determination. "Enough to overwhelm us," she replied. "And they're not here to talk. They're here to take me, to make sure no one stands in their way." Robert's mind raced. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping to himself, never getting involved. Now, it seemed the very trouble he had been trying to escape was standing right in front of him. He looked at the woman, this mysterious stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and changed his life forever. There was no more time to hesitate. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "We fight," she said, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "But we need to be ready. They won't give up easily. If we're going to survive this, we need to stick together." Robert nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. He had never been one to seek out conflict, but he wasn't going to run away now. Not when it mattered. Not when someone was counting on him. "All right," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Let's get ready." The air seemed to grow heavier as the night deepened, the stars overhead twinkling coldly as Robert and the Apache woman prepared for the storm that was about to hit. He knew, in that moment, that his life would never be the same. Whatever was coming, he was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The night was thick with tension as Robert and the Apache woman worked quickly to prepare. They had gathered all the supplies they could find, setting up the perimeter as best as they could with the limited time. Robert felt the weight of the situation settling deep in his chest, his hands shaking slightly as he checked his rifle once again. The woman moved with quiet precision, every movement calculated and deliberate. She had grown more serious with every passing hour, her calm demeanor hiding the storm that was building inside her. She was used to this kind of danger, but Robert wasn't. He had spent his life avoiding conflict. But now, standing beside this woman, he knew there was no turning back. He could feel it. This wasn't just a random attack. This was something much bigger, something that threatened not just his life, but everything he had ever known. As the night grew darker, the first signs of the approaching force began to make themselves known. The sound of hooves in the distance reached Robert's ears, growing louder and closer with each passing second. He and the woman exchanged a look, one that said more than words ever could. They were coming. "Get ready," the woman whispered, her voice steady but urgent. Robert nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. The woman moved to the front of the cabin, her eyes scanning the dark landscape. She was looking for any movement, any sign of the approaching threat. "They're not here for a fight," she said softly, her gaze never leaving the horizon. They're here to take me, and they won't stop until they do. Robert's heart tightened. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting something far bigger than himself. As the sound of hooves grew louder, Robert felt his pulse quicken. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass and adding to the tension in the air. It was the calm before the storm. And then, like a bolt of lightning, they appeared, riders on horseback, moving fast and with purpose. There were more of them than Robert had imagined, at least 20, maybe more. They were spread out, riding in formation, their dark figures cutting through the night like ghosts. Robert's grip on his rifle tightened. He was ready. Stay low, the woman instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't hesitate to kill anyone who stands in their way. Robert crouched down, staying out of sight, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. He could see the flash of their weapons, the dark silhouettes of their horses moving swiftly across the open land. The woman stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on her own weapon, her gaze never faltering. "This is it," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "If they come for us, we fight. We don't give up." Robert nodded, his mind racing. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to the solitude of his ranch, to the quiet, peaceful days spent alone with his cattle. But now, standing beside this woman, he understood the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something greater, something he didn't fully understand but was willing to risk everything for. The riders were getting closer now, their horses kicking up dust as they moved steadily toward the cabin. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he braced himself for what was to come. He could hear the woman's steady breathing beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance. They had only one chance to make it through this. As the first rider came into view, Robert took a deep breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The woman moved first, her body a blur of motion as she sprang into action. The rider ahead of them didn't even see it coming. He was taken down in an instant, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The rest of the riders reacted quickly, drawing their weapons and charging forward. But they were too late. Robert and the woman had already positioned themselves, taking down 2 more riders before they even had a chance to retaliate. The battle was fierce, fast, and brutal. The night air was filled with the sounds of gunfire, the crack of hooves on the ground, and the shouts of men caught in the chaos. Robert had never imagined something like this, but he fought with everything he had. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the woman beside him, for the secret she carried, and for the chance to survive. As the dust began to settle, the last of the riders fell, their horses scattered across the open land. Robert stood, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked over at the woman, who was already moving toward him, her face expressionless but filled with a quiet gratitude. They had made it through the first wave, but Robert knew this was far from over. The fight was just beginning. The silence that followed the battle was almost deafening. Robert stood amidst the dust and the fallen riders, his heart still racing, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The woman beside him, as calm and composed as ever, surveyed the scene with a quiet intensity. They had survived the first wave, but Robert knew deep down that this was just the beginning. He could feel it in his bones. This was not a battle they could win with sheer force alone. They needed more than just weapons. They needed knowledge, strategy, and a way to outsmart their enemies. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, he glanced over at the woman. She was standing tall, her eyes scanning the horizon, as though she could already sense the next threat approaching. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough from the adrenaline. She nodded, her gaze never leaving the distance. "We've bought ourselves some time," she said, her voice steady. "But they won't stop. They'll regroup and come back stronger." Robert felt a knot form in his stomach. He had known this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing it from her made it feel even more real. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice quiet. The woman turned to face him, her expression hardening. "We prepare. We can't stay here. They'll know where to find us." "Where do we go?" he asked, though he wasn't sure what answer he was expecting. She paused for a moment, as if considering his question carefully. "There's a place," she said finally, "a hidden location that might give us a chance. But it's dangerous. We'll have to move fast, and we can't afford to be seen. Robert's mind raced. A hidden location. He had no idea what kind of place she was talking about, but it didn't matter. He trusted her, and he knew they had no other choice but to follow her lead. Let's go, he said, his voice firm. We move now. Without another word, the woman mounted her horse, and Robert followed suit. They rode quickly, staying low and moving silently through the landscape. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, but Robert kept his focus on the woman ahead of him, trusting her to lead the way. As they rode, Robert couldn't help but wonder about the place she had mentioned. What was it? Where was it? And why was it so important? He couldn't ask her now. She was too focused, too determined to reveal anything more. He had to trust that she would explain when the time was right. Hours passed, and the land began to change. The flat plains and sparse brush gave way to thicker forests, and the air grew cooler. Robert felt the weight of exhaustion beginning to settle into his bones, but he didn't dare stop. They couldn't afford to. He could sense the urgency in the woman's movements, in the way she glanced over her shoulder every now and then. She was watching for something, waiting for something, and Robert had learned enough in the past few days to know it wasn't just the riders they had to worry about. It was the unknown, the things lurking in the dark, just out of sight. Eventually, they reached a small clearing in the forest. The woman halted her horse and motioned for Robert to do the same. He obeyed, his senses on high alert as they both dismounted. This is the place, she said quietly, looking around. Robert took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. What now? She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small, weathered map. She unfolded it carefully, tracing her finger along the lines with practiced precision. We need to go deeper into the forest, she said. There's a cave, hidden from view. We'll stay there for the night and rest. Robert nodded, though his mind was still racing. He could sense something wasn't right. Do you think they're still following us? He asked, his voice low. The woman hesitated, her eyes scanning the trees. I'm sure of it, she replied. They're not far behind. We need to move fast. They set off again, the dense forest closing in around them. The trees seemed to loom higher, the air growing colder as they made their way through the thick underbrush. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy, and Robert's senses were on edge. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made him jump. It felt like they were being watched, hunted. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the cave. It was hidden behind a large boulder, nearly impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. The woman led the way, and Robert followed closely behind. As they entered the cave, Robert could finally relax, if only slightly. The darkness inside was thick, but there was enough room for them to move around. The woman lit a small fire with a bundle of dry twigs and sticks, and they sat down, their bodies sore from the ride. We'll rest here for now, the woman said, her voice softer now. But we can't stay long. Tomorrow, we need to keep moving. Robert nodded, though his mind was still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were just getting started. Whatever was coming, it was going to be worse than anything he could have imagined. The fire crackled softly in the darkness of the cave, the flames casting a faint glow on the walls as Robert sat across from the Apache woman. The exhaustion from the long ride and the intensity of their escape weighed heavily on both of them, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Robert had spent the past few hours trying to process everything that had happened, everything that was still happening. His life had turned upside down since he helped her, and now, as he sat there in the flickering light of the fire, he couldn't help but feel like they were running from something much bigger than either of them. The woman was sitting still, her posture rigid as always, but Robert could see the weight in her eyes. She was tired too, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. She had been carrying this burden for far too long, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. How long do we stay here? Robert asked, breaking the silence. His voice was rough from the dust of the trail and the tension of the past few days. The woman didn't look up immediately, her gaze focused on the flames, but when she spoke, her voice was calm. Just until morning, she said. We need to keep moving. They'll find us soon enough. Robert's stomach twisted at the thought. He didn't like the idea of being hunted, of running like prey, but he knew she was right. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. He glanced around the dark cave, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on him. It felt wrong to be here, to be hiding like this. Do you think they'll catch up to us? He asked, his voice quieter this time. The woman finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable. They're always close, she replied, her voice steady. But they won't catch me. Not if I can help it. Robert nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. There was something in her tone, something resigned, that made him think she wasn't as confident as she appeared. But he didn't press her. She had been through far more than he could understand. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and walked over to the entrance of the cave, looking out into the vast, empty land. The moonlight bathed the desert in a cold glow, the landscape stretching out endlessly before him. It felt like they were at the edge of the world, and in a way, they were. He thought about the mark on his door, the strange symbol that had been carved there. It had been a warning, he realized, but from who? And why was he dragged into this? The question had been haunting him since the woman had left it, but now, standing there alone in the quiet desert, the answer seemed just out of reach. He turned back to the woman, who was still sitting by the fire. What happens if they do catch up to us? He asked. This time, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him for a moment, as though weighing her words. If they do, she began slowly, they'll want me, but they'll take you too. You've helped me, and for that, they won't let you walk away. Robert's heart skipped a beat. They'll kill me, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's gaze softened, though her face remained stoic. Not if you're lucky, she said. But I'm not sure luck is on our side. The weight of her words sank deep into Robert's chest, and he felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had known the risks, but hearing it so plainly made it all feel far more real. The silence returned, thicker this time, as Robert stood there, trying to process what she had said. He wasn't sure what he expected from her, but it wasn't this. He had thought maybe they could escape, maybe they could outrun whatever was hunting them. But now he wasn't so sure. The woman was strong, capable, but even she seemed to know the odds were stacked against them. Robert sat back down by the fire, his mind racing. What are we running from? He asked, his voice low. She didn't hesitate this time, her eyes locking with his. A group of men who want power. They'll stop at nothing to get it. And I'm the key to getting what they want. Robert frowned. What do you mean you're the key? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have knowledge. Information that could change everything for them. And they'll do whatever it takes to make sure I give it to them. Robert swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't understand fully, but he didn't need to. He knew now that he wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting for hers. And whatever happened, he wouldn't let her face it alone. The night stretched on in the cave, and Robert's thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion and fear. The woman's words echoed in his mind. They'll stop at nothing. His chest tightened as he thought about what they were up against. Whatever power these men sought, whatever they thought they could gain by capturing her, it seemed like it was worth anything to them. He wasn't sure what kind of world he had walked into, but he knew one thing for sure. He was now part of it. There was no turning back. The woman had said they would come for her, and they would come for him, too. He had tried to imagine what that meant, but the truth was, he couldn't fathom what it would feel like to be pursued by a force so relentless, so dangerous. And yet, here they were, hiding in this cave, preparing for the next wave. Do you know where they are? Robert finally asked, breaking the silence that had lingered in the air for hours. The woman looked up from the fire, her face shadowed in the dim light. She didn't respond immediately, her mind clearly elsewhere. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a quiet determination. I know they'll be close by, but what matters now is that we make sure they don't find us before we're ready. We need to move, and we need to do it quickly. Robert felt a knot in his stomach. She was right. There was no time to waste. He couldn't help but feel like the walls were closing in, like every step they took only made the danger more real. How do we fight them? He asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. The woman stood up, her movements smooth, practiced. She walked over to where their horses were tied and began checking the saddlebags, making sure they had everything they needed for the journey ahead. We don't fight them head on, she said as she worked. That's what they expect. We need to outsmart them, stay one step ahead. Robert watched her, trying to make sense of her calmness in the face of such danger. She was a warrior in her own right. He could see that now, but he wasn't. He had spent his life running cattle, tending the land. Nothing like this. He wasn't sure he had it in him. But how? We're just two people. They have an army, don't they? The woman turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel like she was seeing right through him. They have strength, but we have the advantage of knowing the land. We know how to move quietly, how to stay out of sight. We use their size. Against them, they'll be expecting a fight. We'll give them something they don't expect. Nothing. Robert swallowed hard. It made sense, but it also terrified him. The idea of disappearing into the wilderness, running instead of fighting, felt wrong. He wasn't a coward, but it felt like he was running from something much bigger than just the men chasing them. What if that doesn't work? He asked, the question lingering in the air between them. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to her horse, adjusting the saddle. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but there was no fear in it. Then we fight, but not until we have no other choice. Robert stood up and walked over to her. He had to admit, he didn't have a better plan. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's get moving. They mounted their horses and set off into the night, the sounds of their hooves muffled by the thick ground. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole as they moved deeper into the forest. The woman led the way, her movements efficient and purposeful. Robert followed close behind, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but his thoughts were racing. They rode for hours, the only sounds the rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of the wind. Robert didn't ask her where they were going. He trusted her judgment. If she had a plan, he would follow it. But as the hours passed, the sense of unease in his gut grew stronger. They couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. Eventually, they would be cornered, and then what? He didn't know how long they could keep up this chase. Finally, the woman stopped, her hand raised in the air to signal him to halt. Robert pulled his horse to a stop beside her, his heart racing. "What's wrong?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She listened intently, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "We're not alone," she said, her voice low and serious. Robert tensed, straining his ears to listen, but all he could hear was the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the trees. "I can't hear them," she added, her eyes narrowing. "They're closer than we thought." Robert's heart pounded in his chest. The woman was right. They weren't alone anymore. He could feel the presence of someone, or something, out there, watching them. The silence was deafening, and for the first time since they had started running, Robert felt like they were trapped. The air was thick with tension, and he knew that whatever was coming, it was going to happen soon. The woman's warning hung in the air, and Robert felt the weight of it settle in his chest. They weren't alone anymore. The sounds of the forest around them had shifted, the quiet hum of nature replaced by an unsettling stillness. Robert strained his ears, trying to catch even the faintest hint of movement. The night was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stars above. He could feel his pulse quicken as the tension between them grew. The silence, so heavy it almost felt suffocating. "They're getting closer," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to move. Now." Robert nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had been running, but now it was clear that the chase was over. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. He turned his horse, following the woman's lead as she guided them through the thick brush, her movements fluid and precise. She had been in situations like this before, he could tell. She knew how to survive. But Robert? He was still new to all of this. His mind raced, thinking of the danger that lay ahead. They had fought, they had run, and now they were about to face something even worse. As they rode through the dense woods, Robert could feel the presence behind them grow stronger. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dark for any sign of movement, but all he could see were the shadows of trees stretching out like dark fingers. It was impossible to tell who, or what, was following them. They couldn't afford to stop. If they did, they would be caught. "Keep moving," the woman said sharply. "We can't afford to slow down." Robert urged his horse forward, pushing himself harder than before. His muscles ached from the days of constant movement, but he didn't have time to think about that now. They were in danger, and it was only a matter of time before they were face to face with whoever was hunting them. They reached a clearing, and the woman stopped abruptly, raising her hand to signal Robert to halt. She turned in the saddle, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharp intensity. Robert pulled his horse to a stop beside her, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle at his side. The woman's expression was grim. "They're close," she said, her voice low. They'll be here soon. Robert felt his heart race. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the only sounds now the pounding of his heart and the rustling of the wind through the leaves. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. This was it. They had no more time to run. The woman dismounted from her horse, her movements swift and sure. She looked at him, her face hard with resolve. We're going to have to fight, but not the way they expect. Robert's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he didn't question her. He trusted her. He had to. He followed her, dismounting and moving quickly to find cover behind a thick cluster of bushes. They needed to make a plan, and they needed to do it fast. The woman crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the area. We can't take them all on head-to-head, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We need to pick them off one by one, take them by surprise. The more of them we take down quietly, the better chance we have. Robert nodded, his fingers tightening around the rifle. He had never imagined he would be here, preparing for a fight like this. But now, standing beside this woman, he knew there was no other choice. I'll follow your lead, he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety crawling up his spine. She gave him a sharp nod. Stay close, and stay quiet. We need to keep them from knowing where we are until the last possible moment. The minutes dragged on as they waited, the tension in the air almost palpable. Robert could feel his nerves getting the better of him, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had no room for mistakes now. He heard the sound of hooves in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. His heart skipped a beat. The riders were here. The woman motioned for him to stay low, and he crouched down behind the bushes, barely daring to breathe. He could hear them now, at least half a dozen riders, moving steadily through the trees. The woman glanced at Robert, her expression calm and determined. We take them on when they pass us. Stay sharp. Robert nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear their voices now, low murmurs as they rode closer, their horses moving through the brush. He could feel the tension building inside him, his body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. And then, as the riders came into view, the woman moved. She was like a shadow, slipping out from behind the bushes and into the trees, silent and deadly. Robert followed her lead, moving quickly but quietly, his footsteps barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. They struck first, taking down the first rider before he even had a chance to react. The others scattered in surprise, their eyes wide as they realized they were under attack. But it was too late. Robert and the woman moved like a well-oiled machine, taking down the riders one by one, each strike swift and silent. The forest around them seemed to close in, the only sounds now the faint crack of twigs underfoot and the quick breaths of their attackers as they fell. When it was over, the forest fell silent again. The riders were gone, their horses scattered in the trees. Robert stood still, his heart still racing from the fight. He looked at the woman, who was already scanning the area, her face unreadable. We're not done yet, she said, her voice low. But we've bought ourselves some time. As the last of the riders fell, Robert stood still for a moment, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The quiet of the forest felt almost unnatural, the tension hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, still processing what had just happened. The woman, her movements sharp and precise, was already looking to the horizon, her eyes scanning for any sign of the next threat. Robert could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was far from over. We need to move, she said, her voice calm, though there was an underlying urgency to it. Robert didn't need to ask why. He had seen the way the riders had scattered. They would regroup. They would come back. And they would be angrier. Where? He asked, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline. North, she replied. There's a place I know, a safe house hidden away from here. It's the only chance we have to get ahead of them. Robert nodded without hesitation, his mind already racing to keep up with the plan. They had no time to waste. He had barely started to comprehend the gravity of the situation, and now, it was all too real. They had made it through the first wave, but the battle for survival was just beginning. Let's go, he said. They mounted their horses again, moving quickly and quietly through the trees. The forest seemed to swallow them whole, the moonlight barely reaching through the thick canopy above. The air was cool, and Robert's mind raced as they rode deeper into the wilderness. The woman's calm demeanor helped him steady his own nerves, but he knew that wasn't going to last forever. Every moment they spent in the open was another step toward danger. The night stretched on, and as the hours passed, the landscape around them began to change. The dense forest gave way to rocky terrain, and the ground grew uneven beneath their horses' hooves. Robert's muscles ached from the ride, but he kept his focus. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. "We're getting closer," the woman said, her voice steady. Robert didn't ask how she knew, but he trusted her instincts. She had already proven that she knew this land better than he did. They rode on in silence. The only sounds the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As they neared a ridge, the woman held up her hand, signaling for them to stop. Robert pulled his horse to a halt beside her, his heart racing. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low. "But we need to be careful. They'll be searching for us. If they're following, they'll be close." Robert's stomach tightened at the thought. The possibility of being found was always there, lurking in the background. But they had made it this far. He wasn't about to give up now. "What do we do?" he asked. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she dismounted from her horse, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. Robert followed suit, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. "We hide," she said. "We wait. If they find us here, it will be over. But if we stay still, stay quiet, we might have a chance." Robert nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. They had been running, fighting, surviving, but now, it was about patience. They needed to wait for the right moment. They dismounted and moved carefully into a small cave-like opening at the base of the ridge. It was hidden from view, a small alcove surrounded by thick foliage and rocks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The woman quickly made a fire, its small flame flickering in the darkness, and they settled in, the exhaustion of the past few days catching up to them. Robert couldn't help but feel the tension still in the air. The danger wasn't over. They both knew that. The night passed slowly, and Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every sound, every movement outside the alcove made him jump. But the woman remained calm, her eyes closed as if she had learned to shut out the world around her. As dawn approached, the woman stirred, her eyes flicking open. "They're here," she said quietly. Robert's heart raced again. He couldn't see them, but he knew she was right. The stillness of the morning was broken by the faint sound of movement in the distance. They weren't alone. They would have to move quickly, or they would be trapped. Robert looked at the woman, who was already gathering her things. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the danger that loomed. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let's go." They mounted their horses once again, their movements swift and practiced. As they rode, the woman took the lead, guiding them through the rocky terrain, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of their pursuers. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft light over the landscape. But Robert didn't feel the warmth of it. Instead, all he felt was the cold weight of what was coming. They had no more time to waste. The final battle was approaching, and this time, there would be no more running. Only one thing was certain. They would either survive or die trying.